Hi, my name is Jay. I go by she, her. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and having us host this session. I'm an architect. I work for Shop Architects. I am a lobby member since 2017. And yeah, I'm just very excited to be talking about a very topic that's very close to my heart and close to my sort of daily activities as well. So yeah, I'll pass it back to Shota or Keefer, actually.
Yeah, so just to give you an overview of the training is divided over 3 sessions. The first session being sort of why unionize, the second being what is a union, where we'll talk really about the benefits of unions and sort of the mechanics and like legal mechanisms through which they work. And then session 3 is how to build a union. So in that session, we'll really be talking about how you go about organizing to win a union at your workplace, and some of the larger strategic questions of how we get from point A to point B on this critical question of unions. Today is why unions. So we're going to be talking about sort of like the working class as agents of change and the kind of history of the US labor movement, why the lobby, why do we talk about labor, and what we really want to get into is this sort of critical question of how we build power as architects and where we find that. So that's the kind of big picture for today. But before we jump into that, I want to hand it over to Peggy, who's one of our guest speakers for this session, who is just going to talk for a little bit about why we emphasize in the Architecture Lobby this idea of the architect as worker. Obviously, that's something pretty fundamental to the Architecture Lobby and sort of fundamental to this session. So Peggy, why don't you go ahead and take it away to give us the kind of brief explanation there.
Hi, thanks. I don't think this is complicated, and I feel like we're probably all here because we understand the necessity of identifying as workers, but I'll just go through kind of 3 basic points. One reason to do it is because we are workers, and it's important to recognize that workers is not a dirty word. It is a description of our daily lives, and a daily lives that separate our home life from our domestic life, and is monetized by and contributes to the GDP and operates in capitalism's favor. That separation of home and work. Another is that if we don't identify as workers, we cannot and will not relate to other workers, and we will succumb to capitalism's rhetoric of divisions based on class, race, education, and occupation, and with that, a false hierarchization between them. It will be impossible to see ourselves as a collective with rights and power unless we so identify. And finally, it's important to emphasize the architect as worker because it is the first and most basic step in forming a union and practicing collective bargaining.
Thanks, Peggy. Shota, take it away. You're next on the agenda here.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. I will try to, I guess, contextualize this idea of architects being workers within the connection of architects to the working class. So why is the working class so powerful, and why should this be kind of the focus of our organizing and of the orientation of our organization. So firstly, when we talk about architects as workers, I think we're specifically recognizing this relation of the architect to the means of production, right? So it's not their self-identification or their political preferences on a personal level or anything like that. And we can understand that if architects are workers, because of that their labor is then being exploited. This is because working architects sell their time to the boss, right? Rather than making their living from a share of the income, the way that a boss does from the firm, for instance. And we can see the upshot of this like distinction in the measures that maximize the profitability of an office. These are the long hours and low wages, precarious working conditions, sort of all of the things, all of the kinds of experiences that tend to bring people to the architecture lobby. It means that the interests of the owner and the interests of the worker are counterposed, and that improvements to working conditions necessarily means a reduction in the profitability of a firm. And more importantly, this means a reduction in the political and economic power that the firm owner holds. So at the largest scales, this manifests as a resistance to change. Like capital will resist any change that like threatens this profit motive. And this is a resistance to any changes that would make work more rewarding or society more equitable and democratic. So what happens in the workplace also gets mirrored at the scale of electoral politics and legislation, where progressive reforms are consistently undermined because they demand these concessions, either challenging profit in itself or holdings through taxation, for instance. So what all this means is that the power that capitalists hold is constantly mobilized to oppose exactly the kinds of changes that would improve the material conditions of the working class, and the kinds of changes that like we're fighting for in architecture. And we could say that folks are fighting for sort of under other kinds of wage labor. So the big question, obviously, is how do we overcome this opposition? And where do we find the kind of power that can challenge the sort of money and influence that the capitalist class wields? Well, the good news and the very exciting part of this is that we have it, actually, almost, not really yet. That's to say that since the owner class needs workers in order to make a profit, that without the cooperation of the worker, the whole thing kind of falls apart. And this is the ability of workers to like assert control over their labor. It means to refuse or to threaten to refuse to work. It's exactly the leverage to disrupt the economy in a way that no other group can. And it's the group part of this that's like instrumental. And it's why I said almost, right? Because it's a power that only comes from a concerted effort. And, you know, like an individual that's refusing to work can't assert this power and aren't capable of actually stopping production. So like a minority can be easily replaced or punished, but if it's a majority of the workforce, it can't. So what's necessary for this is kind of resilient, large-scale, collective, or to use our parlance, organized action. And this is exactly the difficult part because we need to get there. We have to get across the almost. So you might hear labor people say that the working class is already organized. It just happens to be against their interests. And this is sort of exactly what Peggy was talking about, right? Pointing to the many things that like keeps the working class divided and sort of fighting over like this shrinking so-called slice of the pie. But the same view that kind of the same analysis that lets us show how workers are exploited also shows how much they have in common, right? And how their interests are aligned with one another and against the boss. So recognizing this really is how we build solidarity and how we begin to take control of our working conditions. So, you know, how do we build this power and how do we wield it? It's through an organized working class. And how this happens is through working class institutions. These are powerful democratic unions that can represent their membership and the coalitions of unions sort of in the labor movement at large. And these can focus on workplace struggles and coordinate larger actions around bigger political goals and sort of make wins beyond the scale of like any one campaign. So mobilizing working people in this way has really been kind of critical to like every progressive win sort of the past century and, you know, certainly lately. And not only sort of for, you know, workplace issues like safety or pay or work hours, but like really overarching reforms around things like voting or civil rights. I think I was very excited about the news from Bolivia. And, you know, like the general strikes there were like a really great kind of recent example of this that like put pressure on the coup government to hold elections and sort of recognize the democratic franchise. So this, all of this is kind of really the historical agency that the working class holds, but it's an agency that's like not abstract. It's directly linked to the level of working class organization, and thus this ability to make real kind of lasting change happen. So like we say that when we organize to win, which is the sort of labor motto, but we have to organize in order for that to happen. So next I'm gonna hand it off to Jay to talk a little bit about the labor movement.
Thanks, Shota. So I think it's important for us to bring this conversation about workers in the context which it comes from. So it's the U.S. labor movement. So in this section, we're going to be focusing on the history. It's going to be a very brief history of the labor movement, its decline and resurgence. We're also going to try and insert to that history how the architects have played a role within that and how they became workers. And we're also going to talk about how architects have, participated or come together and formed a union in the past here in the U.S. And that's going to be led by Peggy. But for this next section, for the history, the decline and resurgence, we're going to be handing it off to Kate Maich. And before I pass it over to Kate, I just wanted to do a brief intro. She's not a lobby member, but she has been a sort of sideline cheerleader for the lobby efforts, because I always talk to her about everything that I do with the lobby and elsewhere. She's a professor of sociology, assistant professor of sociology at Penn State. She's a professor of labor and employment relations, and also a faculty affiliate in the sociology, women's gender and sexuality studies, Latin American studies, and the Center for Global Workers' Rights. Her teaching and research interests include gender, labor informality, domestic work, law, digital organizing, ethnography, and Latin America. She has a long bio. So without further ado, I'll just hand it over to Kate, and I'll let her share her screen as well. Or can she?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jay, and everyone for having me. And yeah, if you don't mind making me a co-host, then I can go ahead and share this PowerPoint that's probably too long, but I'll try to be quick with it. I just want to start off by saying that a lot of this material comes from something called the Labor School at Penn State, where I teach, which is a part of our department that does a lot of outreach with unions and the labor movement today. I'm also a former union member of 2 different UAW locals in Massachusetts and California. I was a grievance handler for the UAW in the past. I was also an organizer with the UFCW and a former member of the Wobblies, which was a very cool experience. So again, thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to try to kind of go through this and talk a little bit about lessons from the past and what we can sort of take from those. Obviously, there's so much to talk about in labor history, so I'll kind of go quickly, but I think these are main themes that we can observe across time. And so like Jay was starting us off, we have to recognize that when we talk about the labor movement, this history really is grounded in the labor of unfree, unpaid workers, right? So thinking about slaves and servants, and thinking especially about the sort of foundational work in the country, right? And how, in fact, the struggle for rights and dignity of workers actually began, right? Rooted in these practices themselves. And so I think sort of acknowledging that history is a really key part of seeing where this movement actually started and came from. And so if we look to, going back to 1776, we can see that in fact slaves made up 20% of the US population. In Philadelphia, which was a key part of a lot of kind of a site of organizing and a site of kind of key moments in the labor movement, more than 75% of the population, right, had been servants or were currently servants. And so we can see, in fact, that many of these slave rebellions and organizing efforts that in fact were beginning, thought to be part of that particular movement, were really some of the first kind of labor actions that we can recognize across the US, and kind of an important recognition, right? The second lesson is just that labor rights had to be won. So for most of history, unions haven't operated under particular kinds of labor protections. And in fact, what they'd often do is sort of face off against management and their bosses, but also face off against government, right? So they would often have to sort of challenge, right, both kind of forces at the same time, including federal troops, et cetera. And so changing labor legislation and policy, and then putting that labor legislation into practice has long been a part of the labor movement. But as we know, fighting battles through legal means is also limited, right? We're not going to build power just by using lawyers, right? So sort of this idea of seeing some of those changes I'm seeing the law as part of this, right? And so when we think about these labor rights, first being one, we can look to the first general strike, right? So a huge general strike that happened in Philadelphia back in 1835. And what was important about this strike is that it really was precedent setting. So more than 20,000 workers were striking for a decrease in the workday down to 10 hours from 12 or 14 or 16, probably like many of the work days that you all are experiencing, right? And in fact, this, they were successful, and in fact, this, kind of spread and this grew. And so a wave of general strikes soon followed, and this thus put enough kind of public pressure for the entire country to adopt the same standard, right? We also see a great uprising that happened in 1877. And again, a series of thousands and thousands of these federal injunctions that were issued by government against labor. Okay, so these were not easy rights to win. Moving into the 1880s, an important doctrine that we still see present governing most American workplaces is called employment at will. And so basically this idea that there's sort of an equal division of labor rather than a strong power imbalance between employee and employer, and that employees can be let go, without any concern about cause whatsoever, right? So this idea of kind of equality and that workers can just simply be let go really was key and caused another kind of fomenting of protest. So in 1886, May Day was founded when we had this unbelievable kind of strong protest happening in Chicago. 80,000 workers were out striking. And then in a rally a few days later, right, this kind of infamous moment when someone threw a bomb into the crowd that killed some people. And thus these 4 of these organizers were convicted without evidence. And this was the kind of foundation of May Day, right, which ironically is celebrated throughout the world, but not really. It's sort of a political moment in Labor Day in the US, right? Moving into the early 20th century, Mother Jones played a huge role in changing a lot of these, changing in fact kind of the face of factory labor, since this was mostly children. And so they actually marched from Philadelphia to Long Island to confront President Roosevelt about these working conditions. They were actually trying to, again, kind of lower the working hours and point out the intense, dangerous conditions that they were working for. And this worked, again, right? 2 years later, these laws were brought about to actually try to set these limits on laws or on the hours and sort of try to enforce the safety for these children. We also start to see in the early 20th century organizations forming, labor organizations, including the IWW, which is arguably the most egalitarian labor organization in the world, which is still around today, which is kind of exciting. Then thinking again back into the factories, female garment workers had a huge role to play in the early labor movement. So this uprising of the 20,000, even more than 20,000, these were mostly immigrant working women who were trying to raise awareness about the terrible sweatshop conditions and, workers being locked into factories, right, in these intensely dangerous conditions. So in fact, this actually worked for a number of factories in New York, but not, unfortunately, for the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, even though these conditions and the difficulties had been, raised previously. In fact, they were ignored by the factory owners, who escaped themselves from the roof of the building, leading to almost 150 workers being killed. That led into the Bread and Roses strike of the following year, which was again kind of a huge moment, thinking about women workers organizing together and really standing up for their particular rights, especially in the workplace, especially in factories. And I think this really brings us kind of to lesson 3. So if we look back at labor history, we can see that unions have been most successful generally when they've been inclusive. So Bayard Rustin here has a quote about the idea that kind of these racial and ethnic loyalties have often kind of masked this notion of class struggle that's underneath, right? And of course, this has been something that employers have been ready to use, right? Ready to use against workers time and time again. So thinking about when unions have been inclusive, especially around bringing more gender equality into the workplace, by 1850, a quarter of US manufacturing workers were women. There were also a large number of women entering into different workforces, but they have generally always been kind of overlooked. Another labor organization that was actually more inclusive was the Knights of Labor, founded in 1870. And what was unique about them is that they actually accepted women and Black members, African-American members, but at the same time, they also were anti-Chinese. They supported the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this sort of notion of the contradictory sense of inclusion, right? But at a particular kind of interesting moment in labor history. Quickly moving on, just a point to sort of say, I'll give away the answer here, but which immigrant group did not face anti-immigrant or nativist opposition, right? The answer is none of the above. So all these various groups of immigrant workers at different times were facing this, right? And so employers have kind of tended to exploit these racial and gender divisions. Especially we see this with Black workers often being used as strike breakers, coming especially from the South into kind of heavily industrial areas like Chicago or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia and New York. The fourth lesson, and I'll wrap this up very soon, is just that labor has repeatedly reinvented itself, right? In response to these rapidly changing kind of forms of the economy and the way that the economy is organized. So if we think back to kind of New Deal legislation, right, which was, you know, exciting and unprecedented in a certain way, this really came about because strikes and protests were kind of pushing forward this response. But as strong as these laws were at the time, they weren't enough and they didn't cover everyone. So they purposely excluded farm workers and domestic workers. And we see, for instance, with the Bracero program, where contract workers from a number of countries, especially Mexico, were brought over without any sense of labor rights. This led, though, following the New Deal legislation, to a number of strike waves, which was kind of on the heels of the Second World War, and then moving into kind of big social movement era changes that were happening, right, where we see the Civil Rights Act coming about, and a number of different questions about rights in the workplace as well as in the home and kind of within broader social life. For federal employees, this was really important because they finally won the right to collectively bargain. However, it remains that it's still legal for them to actually go on strike, right? And this kind of comes up in different moments throughout history. The final lesson is simply that change happens because of movement, right? So there's a movement in the labor movement, not just sort of the history itself, but when workers don't just wait for the law to actually make those changes or organize. So these mass movements really drive reform. And I'll just quickly mention a few that have happened in the last 30 years and more recently, where we can really see these huge changes happen. So the Justice for Janitors strike was really kind of a landmark moment for the Janitors Union of SEIU in Los Angeles, mostly immigrant men and women from Mexico and Central America. And actually this scene, I think, is important because it was in fact kind of the community's response to this police brutality that they saw that actually kind of made a change, right? And sort of the tide of these various strikes that were going on, as well as the role of strategic corporate research, which continues to be really important in today's struggles to unionize. More recently, we saw in Wisconsin a real crackdown happening on public sector workers' ability to collectively bargain, right? And this was, again, kind of a moment of unity. We saw, you know, Black Lives Matter and then continuing and even more kind of strong relevance of this, thinking about kind of broadening a conversation about race in the labor movement and these ideas of exclusion that have continued to plague organized labor, and in fact, what a new labor movement would look like, right? That would actually value all of these particular members. We also can note the fast food worker strike, and this is kind of tied to the fight for 15. And this is interesting too, because it brings up these ideas around kind of industrial unionism.
Workers, and to do that, it's really important that
that's me.
I promise I'm on the last couple slides. And then 2016 showed us actually the largest modern strike in kind of US, you know, modern history with Verizon, which was really exciting. And then more recently, in fact, the largest number of work stoppages that we saw in, you know, roughly 30 years with the Red for Ed movement in education. And what was interesting, I think, especially about these, right, was that they happened in these, you know, traditionally conservative, traditionally Southern states that actually have few or no collective bargaining rights. And just to point out sort of, again, this idea of sort of the change that happens because of movement those who are riding their bikes, there continues to be really exciting global movements going on that workers in the US are tied to. And I think that's an important part of our labor history too, when we think about transnational organizing that's going on, for instance, by food delivery workers and other workers who are harnessing these digital tools to really make changes for themselves in the workplace and to make a better future. And then finally, I just wanted to have a shout out, since we're trying to organize at Penn State right now as well. You know, a lot of faculty unions are coming about and setting important precedent for fellow workers in academia, right, who are thinking more about kind of the changing precarity and a voice at work, right, that we need there as well. And so thank you for letting me do this speed talk, and I hope this was sort of informative, and thanks so much. It's really an honor to be with all of you.
Thanks, Kate. I'm gonna, apologies for my lack of mute button discipline. Usually I'm on my A game there. We gave you like an impossible task to sort of gloss over US labor history in a very brief window of time, but it's super helpful to understand that context and that history. Thank you, I really appreciate it. I'm gonna talk briefly about sort of the architects piece of this, right? How architects have become workers. One sort of phrase you might have come across when we're talking about lobby stuff is how architects are proletarianizing. So I really wanted to kind of bring some historical sort of analysis to that. And to do that, I kind of have to like go back in time. So, and I'm going to, use some socialist terminology. We're familiar with the idea of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the proletariat being the working class, the bourgeois being the owning class, the capitalists. But there's a sort of third class that Marx talks about, which is the petit bourgeois. And the petit bourgeois are, in essence, a kind of class of smallholders who are not big-time capitalists, but they own a little bit of their own means of production. And I think historically, architects have kind of fit into that mold, which is rather interesting. And the reason for that is that capitalism didn't sort of like rid itself of the vestiges of feudalism or older modes of political economy overnight. In some cases, it tolerated them. In others, it sought to adapt them. I think an example of this is like the monarchy, right? In some cases, capitalists sought to overthrow the monarchy in like the English Civil War. And then later on, they sort of transformed it into a money-making tourist trap. But the way that this applies to architecture is there was an adaptation of the kind of guild structure and the master builder type into a kind of fusion with the kind of gentlemanly professional petit bourgeois smallholder. And for the kind of early history of architecture as a profession, this is the kind of class position of the architect. And this figure was not a capitalist exactly, but they definitely weren't working class. They were politically useful to capital in organizing urban environments for various political ends. This is something that Manfredo Tafori writes quite a bit about in Architecture and Utopia. We can think about things like the City Beautiful movement or garden cities, even though they're very sort of progressive in their ambition, as sort of being ultimately accepted by capital and enacted by capital because they were kind of useful as means of social control or as concessions to the working class. So architects found themselves in this kind of intermediate role, both politically and in terms of class. However, capitalism is always trying to sort of craft the world into its like own hyper-industrial sort of image. And it does that through de-skilling workers and specializing production. Marx actually talks quite a bit in the Communist Manifesto about the kind of downward pressures that capitalism places on the petit bourgeois to try to kind of thrust them into the proletariat and industrialize their work. And you start to see the first steps towards industrialization in architecture. And I'm not talking about building, I'm really specifically talking about architecture. Occur in the late 19th century with the development of the general contractor as a distinct specialization, and also the proliferation of sort of drafting staff and support staff in architecture offices. But oftentimes these sort of firms were still relatively small compared to kind of the emerging powerful corporations led by robber barons that kind of mark the apotheosis of capitalist industrialization and are with us today in sort of different and financialized forms. So this trend really picked up steam until the post-war period, when we witnessed the birth of mega firms that were sort of organized around corporate lines. And here the kind of organizational schema of the factory, something that we traditionally associate with wage labor, can really start to be applied to architecture offices. Obviously, there's not manual labor. Obviously, the pay might be better because there's an element of skilled labor involved. And so, you know, I'm not trying to make a kind of false equivalency here, but the organizational structures really kind of matter and kind of mark the transformation of the architect and the architectural worker more generally, their kind of transformation into the working class. So we see in these workplaces a workforce that's extremely alienated. There's little to kind of no meaningful relationship to the products of their labor, the designs that they're producing, and almost no opportunity to intervene in the process of production. And you know, this is a really troubling sort of trend if you kind of care about the social good. But it shows no signs of slowing down. There's an industry trend towards consolidation. Increasingly large firms are buying small firms and medium-sized firms, and well over half of architectural workers sort of work for very, very large kind of corporate offices where they are not in any case, the sort of gentlemanly, professional, petite bourgeois type of old. They are almost definitely workers. And so there's a kind of loss of agency here on one hand, right? The architect of the kind of late 19th century had a kind of agency in sort of dictating how capital was spent and how it flowed, and they were sort of hobnobbing with the wealthy and the elite. And that's not the case for the majority of us anymore. And on one hand, we can kind of mourn that or be reactionary and sort of try to recover that. But I think what's more exciting and sort of more realistic and pragmatic too is to recognize the kind of immense agency that is gained as organizing as a working class. This means that we're not organizing through the products of our labor. Our political agency is not seen as happening through buildings or through design, but it's happening as a result of us organizing in our workplaces our labor power to different ends. So I think that's like a very brief history, and like really a dissertation needs to be done on that subject. I'm kind of just giving a gloss here, but hopefully that schematic is helpful because in kind of connecting A to B. So I'm going to hand it over to Peggy for to kind of talk about a hidden history of a time when some architects were in a union, which is very exciting.
Hi. So this isn't a real history of architects vis-a-vis unions, but it's the specific history of the most prominent one and the one that we know the most about, which is called the Federation of Architects, Engineers, Chemists, and Technicians, FAECT. And so FAECT was formed during the Great Depression on August 23rd, 1933, after the American Institute of Architects formulated wage and work rule codes for the National Industrial Recovery Act. That act asked professionals in the construction industry to outline their own codes and identify an appropriate minimum wage. And the AIA recommended a flat wage of 50 cents per hour, which was only 10 cents above the amount that was suggested for the government for all workers. So anger over this low amount brought architects and other technicians to the August 23rd meeting in New York that was organized by the United Committee of Architects, Engineers, and Chemists, which was a group that was the outgrowth of Local 37 of the International Federation of Technical Engineers, Architects, and Draftsmen Union, a local that had been expelled by the Federation for being too radical, and too radical because they called for strikes that proved to be unsuccessful. Anyway, The United Committee normally attracted a dozen people to its meetings, but this one on August 23rd brought together 500 people. And they formed a delegation to go to Washington, D.C. to testify to the construction industry code hearings in order to challenge the AIA's suggested minimum wage. And they succeeded, and so the Federation, FAECT, was established. The organization was open to all technicians, regardless of gender, race, or class. Only employers were excluded. Only 10 to 15% of the Federation's members were architects, but they were the vocal leaders. By December 1934, which is just a year plus, at their first national convention in Chicago, the union had 6,500 members with 16 locations all over the country. Unionization was not comfortable for all FAECT members. There was tension between those who were politically committed to this form of organized labor, many of whom had European backgrounds, many of whom were communist and were very familiar with organizational tactics. But there are also those who saw FAECT as the only vehicle for extracting fair pay, and they kind of swallowed the political implications of unionization with difficulty, including, again, the links to communists. Still, one of the main engineers and vice presidents of the Federation expressed his surprise at how the white-collar worker movement became a highly radicalized movement, radicalized in the sense of becoming unionist, not necessarily socialist or communist. In 1936, FACET attempted to join the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. It was voted in, only to have that vote vetoed by the union that had previously expelled it from the New York local chapter for being too radical. The rejection, however, turned out not to matter. The Federation was embraced by the newly formed CIO, which better suited the members of FACET, in fact, who, as modern technicians, and at that point, technician was not in any way a derogatory term. It was within the discourse of Taylorism, actually quite significant and had real stature. Anyway, as modern technicians, they identified more with the industry-based CIO than they had with the more conservative craft-based AFL. Anyway, the CIO, for its part, was proud to have its first white-collar union. It represents, John Lewis said, is that the capstone of our conception of a real labor movement extending from the unskilled manual labor to the highly trained professional groups of gainful workers. Between 1936 and the United States entering into World War II at the end of 1941, the AIA was working primarily on directing government work to private architectural offices and thus avoiding offending its major employer, which was the government. FAECT, for its part, opened the instantly popular Federation Technical School in New York, which combated the elitism and difficult tuitions that existed in most architectural schools. They published a paper entitled Producing the Victory, a labor manual for increasing war production that demanded the government create labor and management committees in all defense plants. They proposed a national integrated public works program for the construction of housing, hospitals, schools, and infrastructure programs widely overlooked by the WPA. They forced the WPA to establish prevailing wages across all projects, and they picketed New York City's Parks Commissioner Robert Moses for his anti-labor policies and won. After its entry into the war, the US government put pressure on the US labor forces to freeze wages. FAECT's membership grew at that point to 10,000 by 1941, counting the physicists Frank and Julius Roberts Oppenheimer, as well as the mechanical engineers Julius Roberts and his wife Julius Rosenberg and his wife Ethel Rosenberg, as labor organizers amongst affiliates. Likewise, major architectural figures whose offices worked for the government and shared the stance against labor abuse joined. Urban theorist and architect Percival Goodman, architects and preservationists James Marston Fitch, Sam Ratensky, the first design editor of the New York City Housing Authority, director of the Housing Authority, Frederick Ackerman, the first technical director of the New York City Housing Authority, and Tom Creighton, the editor of Progressive Architecture. They were all members. Here, I just have to say, it was reasonable to organize and possible to organize because even those employers in architectural offices were working for the government. So they, while they were employers for their firm, they were employees of the government. Concurrently to that work, forces opposing the unions also rose. In 1941, the Special Committee to investigate un-American activities pursued communist infiltration of Facet into the Manhattan Project and forced the Berkeley Radiation Laboratory, where Julius and Robert Oppenheimer worked, to be disbanded. More devastatingly, the Taft-Hartley Act of 1974, also known as slave law, neutralized the labor movement by limiting the ability to strike, by allowing states to institute right-to-work laws, and by requiring union leaders to declare that they were not communists. With its ranks thinning, FAECT amalgamated with the left-led and much larger Union of Office and Professional Workers of America, the UOPWA, in March of 1946, becoming Local 231. This union, in turn, was expelled from the CIO in 1948 for refusing to oust its communist members, and FAC essentially died.
Thank you so much, Peggy. That was amazing. And thanks, Keefer and Kate, obviously. Next part, we're gonna move to like connecting all of this to the lobby, but I just wanna say there's like a special kind of like joy in like nerding out over this history that happens with like labor history, because we can like connect, I think, like the kinds of organizing challenges and like the immediate historical moment that like we're confronting with all of these things. So hopefully like we can make that happen for the lobby and for the labor movement right now. Anyway, amazing. I wish we had like all night to talk about this stuff. So why Architecture Lobby and like why labor? This is the kind of sort of really overarching question that I think sort of asks us to like think through some of the things that like we've taken for granted about our organization. So like we've always been labor oriented, but like what does that exactly mean, and sort of what does that mean just for like very concretely, like for our practices, like what do we do and how do we do it? So to like maybe think through some of those questions relative to like this kind of like political analysis and like kind of historical trajectory that we've been outlining all night. We're gonna spend the next section talking a little bit about the role of like the architecture lobby sort of in architectural culture, for the past like, 5, 6, 7 years. We're gonna talk about like who represents architects right now and how. We're gonna think about like where our power comes from. And like Keefer touched on this, but like thinking about like how exactly like we mobilize our power as workers. And lastly, like we're gonna think through how and why the architectural lobby should sort of prioritize worker organizing as like a really kind of central practice. I wanna pass it over to Jay to talk a little bit more about the lobby.
Shota. So we have about maybe 15, 20 minutes. I will speed through some of these slides. But just in a brief little history of the lobby. I mean, I won't really get into that much, but in its most recent past, the lobby has focused a lot on activism to change and influence architecture culture. Activism is necessary, but alone is not sufficient. The lobby itself has a manifesto that lists out several demands, and they're here on the screen. We have 10 specific demands: enforce labor laws that prohibit unpaid internships, unpaid overtime, refuse unpaid competition, refuse fees based on percentage of construction. Number 3, stop peddling a product, buildings, and focus on the unique value architects help realize through spatial services. Number 4, enforce wage transparency across the discipline. Number 5, establish a union for architects, designers, academics, interns in architecture and design. Number 6, demystify the architect as solo creative genius, no honors for architects who don't acknowledge their staff. Number 7, licensure upon completion of degree. Number 8, change professional architecture organizations to advocate for the living conditions of architects. Number 9, support research about labor rights in architecture. And finally, number 10, implement democratic alternatives to the free market system of development. So what's interesting about this is that number 5 is really what we're talking about today: establish a union for architects, designers, academics, and interns in architecture and design. And if we really think about it, if we reach number 5, we actually cover a few others, a majority of others. And if once we do establish that union, we actually could organize ourselves within that union and achieve all of these demands. So how do we do that? I mean, let me back up a little bit. I mean, or if the lobby main goal or aim is to improve the lives of architectural workers and eradicate the violation of labor rights within our profession and subsequently the AEC industry at large, how do we achieve that? What we're talking about today is the main tool that we want to focus on as an organization and as workers. We need to focus our effort towards unionizing, and that takes a lot of effort. Let's really highlight that word, effort. And how do we do that? We organize the workplace. And so in terms of what the lobby can do and what it has been doing already in a sort of distributed or sometimes sporadic approach, is to continue strengthening that presence that we potentially have in the workplace through our membership. So to continue doing that, we need to bring awareness of our status as workers to all of our membership and beyond. We need to bring awareness of our collective power, and that's what we've been talking about here. We need to provide support for workers who are already organizing their workplace towards unions. A lot of us are already looking at, looking at tools or trying to figure out how we get our demands met within our own offices. The lobby can actually provide support in concrete ways. One way is that we actually have lobby members who are experienced organizers. And we also can connect members to resources that if we can't answer those questions or provide that support that it's necessary to get that organizing off the ground in an office, we can point that person or those groups of people and workers to the resources to help their efforts. And additionally, we need to think about the bigger picture, right? Like, we need to raise awareness to our members that our efforts impact the industry at large. This is not an isolated type of directive. This is something that once we tackle the workplace in one area or one city, or maybe in 2 cities or 2 companies, maybe in 1 city, it doesn't matter how small it is, it's going to have a huge impact in the industry at large. Not only architecture, but also engineering and construction. Everybody gets impacted by how we as workers design our contract, really. So we need to, in order to do that, we need to raise awareness of the labor context, which we have been talking about, the context of what we have won historically as labor, not as architects, as workers, architectural workers, as part of this larger context that is the labor movement. We need to bring light to the benefits we enjoy as workers that were fought for. And if we want more, we need to realize that we're gonna have to fight some more. And the last 2 points, we need to raise awareness of the importance of solidarity between all workers. It's not only about architects or architectural workers. And when I say architectural workers, I also mean here, administrative staff, communications, human resources, business development, everyone within an architecture office. It's not only designers and architects. And finally, we need to bring light to the tools we have to get our demands met. We're not making something new here. We're not inventing the wheel. Let's not reinvent the wheel. There are already tools out there And there have been benefits that we benefit from today that have been won and fought for. So how have those benefits been won? And we need to just understand what those tools were, the successful cases, and also the cases that were not so successful. So we learn the lessons and don't replicate, the same maybe wrong steps, that we focus on how we actually can win, like Shota was mentioning in the beginning.
Yeah, so we also need to understand who represents architects now, if not us, who. The AI, and obviously the big elephant in the room there is the AIA. The AIA has 90,000 members. Obviously, what they mean by a membership organization is something very different than what we mean by a membership organization, where we really hope and expect every member to kind of get involved and engage with our activism and organizing work. The AIA basically expects people to pay dues. The fundamental sort of flaw of the AIA is that they've really ended up representing the interests of architecture's management class almost exclusively. With such a big organization, there's always going to be a kind of unevenness there, in sort of sectors or chapters or individual groups within the AIA that we might be able to work with or pressure or have an affinity with or really hate. So just with scale comes that unevenness. But I think at its core, what we can recognize is a very top-down approach to how to represent the interests of workers, top down both in how they organize themselves, but also top down in terms of where their interests lie. Even though a majority of the membership of the AIA doesn't come from the kind of management ranks, if you look at the AIA, sort of who sits on the boards, who occupies the positions of leadership, they're usually folks who come from sort of large firms, and specifically the management class of large firms. I think one of the other things to say about the AIA is that they're always happy to kind of present a veneer of progressivism and sort of uphold examples of social impact architecture and things like this. But what we would critique, I think, what I would critique is their ultimate reluctance to address structural issues. And the reason why they don't address structural issues is because the structure as it's currently constituted works for a lot of their leadership. The status quo benefits people who are at the upper ranks of firms and offices. So I think that's a really important thing to recognize. There might be moments where as an organization, we can kind of force a fissure there or kind of work with elements within the AIA, but ultimately, structurally, it has this kind of difficulty to it. There's also organizations that have a legal or regulatory responsibility, so like NAB or NCARB, or I think we could even talk about like the standards developing organizations that develop building codes or kind of testing standards for different things. And obviously there's kind of issues there. Again, we have entities that are organized from the top down, and again, they're uneven, so we might find opportunities to kind of swing our weight as workers within those kinds of organizations, but ultimately, structurally, they're kind of constrained. And then the other group that represents us in a kind of less formal way is the kind of media and the press, right? They represent the role of the architect to the public. It's one of the things that we talk about in the Architecture Lobby a lot, but we haven't, we don't always fully address it in our organizing work because there's only so much time in the day, is our public perception and sort of changing and modifying the public perception of architects and what they do. And that's something that's really conditioned by the media and the press. And oftentimes what you see, the way that architecture and architects are portrayed in that kind of realm is as sort of technocratic saviors, right? People with the next big idea that's going to come along and sort of save humanity. Some recent examples of this have been, Bjarke Ingels is getting published all over the place, for coming up with some sort of great idea for an eco building. And obviously this doesn't address any of the structural issues that go behind something as immense as climate change. A building doesn't solve that. A technocratic idea doesn't solve that. The architect as a genius figure doesn't solve that. And so, so those are kind of like the big ones, right? Who are kind of, I think, ultimately will be on the kind of wrong side of history in some ways. But there's also other organizations that represent architects who are worth talking about, especially NOMA. Obviously, NOMA plays an important role in advocating around issues of race and equity in architecture, and they do great organizing around this. Their focus isn't necessarily on the bottom-up organizing of workers, but we think that's a serious contribution that we can make as the architecture lobby. But it's important to recognize how NOMA, and in particular NOMAS, the student chapters, have really been at the forefront of pushing schools and holding them to account on racial justice demands, especially in recent moments. There's also the ACSA, which kind of represents architecture's academics in some way, which again is an advocacy organization and sort of very uneven. We've worked with the ACSA in the past, and there's some really fantastic people there, but their sort of theory of change is really premised around an advocacy model, which is all fine and well, but and sort of necessary, but ultimately we believe that more needs to be done. There's also a proliferation of other smaller groups, especially when you compare it to somebody like an organization of the size of the AIA, who are working on more narrow topics like architecture curriculum. So, this is Dark Matter University, Global Architecture History Teaching Collaborative. There's also folks working in the curatorial space like F Architecture, or in this sort of editorial and publishing space like Aggregate, or groups that are sort of premised on producing research like Equity by Design. And again, all of this should be welcomed, and we should be working in solidarity with these organizations that I've mentioned. And I think especially other emerging organizations like Design as Protests. But no one really focuses on organizing architectural workers from the bottom up in the way that we do. And I say that not to pat ourselves on the back, or to be kind of precious or to be first, not at all. It's just to say this is a theory of change that certainly Shota, Jay, and I really believe in. We believe in centering workplace organizing because it's a site of immense potential power in the fight for justice that simply isn't being realized yet, right? Advocacy is important, research is important, all of these things are important, and they need to be important parts of our work, but we need to kind of, I think, be focused on the ultimate sort of ambition of organizing workers in workplaces, because and encourage other organizations who are doing the same. That bottom-up organizing and sort of getting workers together to withhold their labor power, to exercise for material reforms in offices, is a kind of representation we haven't seen yet, and something that I think the lobby is in a really good position to be able to do. I don't know if we're there yet exactly. I don't know that we can actually make that claim for ourselves yet, but I think we're in a good position to do so in the future. And again, I just want to emphasize, we shouldn't be precious or elitist about our organizing efforts. It's really important that we encourage and work in alliance with all of these organizations so we can really leverage our collective power and our different strategies of change. Unless you're the AIA, right? So that goes without saying from the talk. I'm going to hand it over to Shota now, and I fear I might have stole some of his thunder with why we should focus on worker organizing, but Shota, go ahead.
No, thank you. That was the perfect segue. But so, within this field of kind of architecture's representations, so we have the obvious thing that the labor is extremely underrepresented. And sort of in the smaller but very exciting field of progressive organizations that we should be supporting and that we can be working more closely with to collectively advance our goals. We really believe that labor organizing is the kind of vehicle that can contribute to it, and that can kind of sort of hold the architectural part of this movement like together and like give it integrity. So like, why should the Architecture Lobby like prioritize labor organizing? So there are kind of like three sort of big reasons that I'm going to like try to enumerate. Obviously, there are kind of like many particular and like detailed ones, many of which we've talked about like the benefits of unions and like about like the historical advances of the labor movement. But like any of these conversations, like ultimately, I feel like arrives at like one of these kind of strategic and sort of tactical and like organizational reasons. So like labor organizing is something that like builds concrete power for our demands and campaigns. The one-to-one organizing model that like that powers it is something that like would grow our organization, like make it more equitable. And lastly, it's a really material and kind of like direct way to engage with and to benefit from like a growing field of like left formations. So if could we get the next slide? Sorry, I'm not in charge of the buttons. Thank you. I should have. Yeah. So firstly, labor organizing.
Just wanted to do a time check.
Oh yes, I will be very fast. So like labor organizing is something that like builds power. You know, the path to like the sort of structures that like architects need to like transform the production to they transform the profession is directly through the workplace. So collective bargaining through unions would let us kind of materially influence the labor issues that, you know, these are kind of the core of our demands as the lobby, things like pay, overwork, harassment, like discrimination, but also sort of really elevate the basic conditions of the industry as a whole, like setting better standards for everybody in it. Beyond this, it would give us agency kind of in confronting the political issues that we have our stakes in. So, you know, speaking as an organized workforce, the lobby can engage with things like the Green New Deal and anti-incarceration campaigns, not just from like a moral or discursive position, but from a position of like material power. You know, basically, labor power gives our campaigns the kind of teeth that we need to have like a meaningful impact. Secondly, and if I could have the next slide, you know, this kind of labor organizing would build the lobby. And it would build it towards a representative multiracial mass organization, right? So like we've talked in the past about like the lobby is in the hundreds right now. We would like to see it in the thousands. And we, you know, we want to take the AIA on not just sort of on a political and intellectual level, but like in terms of numbers, like we can get the people power. So the premise of the organizing model is like exactly that people power, which involves sort of close personal engagement with workers through one-on-one conversations. This means talking to everybody. And if some folks aren't represented, we ask why. You know, this is really kind of deeply tied into the idea of workplace democracy and like really sort of materially aligns our practices so that we can like fight for not just economic, but also racial equality. It really opens up the field of potential members in a big way that would consist of working architects of all backgrounds and dispositions. And this is really critical is because it would hold us accountable to the conditions of architectural work and would make sure that the lobby is representative really of the field that we're trying to transform. So, you know, if we want to be this mass organization and directly represent kind of a significant fraction of the architecture workforce, we really need to prioritize the shared labor concerns that we have and the resolution of those concerns kind of as the common ground that will hold our orgs together. And so lastly, if we could have the next slide, you know, a really important part of this is that we would be part of a movement. And like, you know, this is instrumental, obviously, in like the labor histories that we heard about, but like, especially kind of in the tumultuous and, you know, like critical times that we're living in, like solidarity is really the key word. And this labor work would really like align us with the growing left formations that are sort of popping up in every kind of political life. So I'm talking about like the strike wave, some of our comrades in Michigan who recently went on strike, for instance, but also like about like left candidates and like ballot measures that are winning, about DSA, about like fighting austerity and sort of who knows what awful fallout we'll have after the COVID. And, you know, we're in a super important position to do this work within architecture. And, you know, like this is because if we don't do it, nobody else will. But the great thing is that like we're not alone. We have all of the organized labor to sort of lean on. So like within our org, we have both the ties to the labor movement and the ties to the organized left to really be able to like contribute to these shared struggles. Labor organizing would form the sort of most immediate connection to this growing left, and it would I think, equip us to better tackle our own goals. So this would mean prioritizing like where we are and like what we have control over. And like for us, this is, you know, the field of architectural labor, and sort of through that, doing our part in like building the power of the working class at large. Yeah. And I'm gonna hand it off next to Jay to talk about where our power comes from.
Thanks, Shota. So this is our last point, and then we'll move into breakout sessions. So thanks for staying with us. So unionizing is not an easy task, but we have to remember we have power, and it comes in a few forms. So just like Shota was saying, we're not alone, right? We're workers, and we're part of a larger context of a movement. So where does our power not lie? I think is an important thing to start off with. So we don't own our means of production, right? Our bosses do. We don't own the firms we work at. So we don't have the power to really have a big say in how our bosses decide how to do things. We don't own our companies, our bosses do. So where does then our power lie? And there are a few ways that we have power already. One is in our labor power. So we sell our labor, and so we can legally withhold it collectively. And as a union, our bosses can't make decisions unilaterally. So all of these are things that once we unionize, we get to benefit from. We don't, like, if we withhold our power, or if we withhold our labor on an individual basis, if we just decide not to show up to work one day and say, hey, I'm not doing it because I don't like our medical benefit, that's not going to have much of an impact on a decision on the employer, right? But if you organize with our coworkers and decide we're not showing up to work because unless you make improvements to our medical insurance, that's a different story. That's going to impact our employer. That's going to impact their pockets. So whenever we impact their pockets, that means we have power. Our power also lies in numbers. So without our labor, companies cease to exist. And organizing the workplace, winning a majority consensus to form a union also is a powerful tool that we get just because we have the numbers. As architectural workers within an exploitative industry, we are a highly skilled profession, so we can't be easily replaced. If we withhold our labor, our bosses can't really find scabs to replace us. If one workplace unionizes, as I mentioned before, we lift standards within our profession at large. And as a domino effect, engineering and construction workers also benefit. So
we
also,
sorry,
just one last point. As the lobby, we also have power. Our power as the lobby and as members of the lobby lie in the fact that all members, all TL members, are potential organizers. We also have this growing network of like-minded individuals and workers in the support we have and that we offer towards workplace organizing efforts. Also in engaging with the wider public and media, shedding light on the precarity of the architectural worker. There are many of us, many members who are constantly engaged with writing articles and books on this very same topic. So it's important to keep this conversation and dialogue going beyond our membership in the lobby itself.
So the next part we had planned was a little bit of a breakout discussion, which I think we needed really like, I guess, 15 minutes to do something with. So it seems like we're gonna put that off till the next time we meet and sort of pick up our conversation there. I guess, oh yeah, Jay, if you want to talk about the Slack channel.
Yeah, so yeah, unfortunately we're running short on time on the breakout, but if we want, you can join the unionization Slack channel, at least so that we can, you know, if you have questions about anything that was said here or talked about, it would be great to start, you know, having discussions about these questions and And we can do this after this.
And we really want to have breakout conversations with all of you, but I know Maya wants to give updates and keep and respect everyone's time, as do we. So you know, I promise if you come back, this is your carrot to come to sessions 2 and 3, where I promise we will have lots of time to kind of like work through these issues together in a more bi-directional sort of way. Which, because Shota, Jay, and I all come from organizing backgrounds, we really want to do. So I hope we can see you there. And then I think Shota might have to go to a union function shortly.
I have to get a bunch of architects to sign cards. It's the best excuse I've ever had. I'm not just failing.
So, but maybe. I don't know what your schedule's like, Jay, but maybe we can stick around if people have questions.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So join us for breakouts in 2 weeks. And Maya, the floor is yours again.